The plot thickens. What we need to do right now is we need to write some code to define a user object. So we need our user class. And I'm going to keep the user class really simple. So we're just going to have the user class know about its user ID and its password. So class user colon, and we're going to create a constructor. And the constructor is going to take 2 arguments. Every method in a Python class takes self as an argument, but the other 2 method arguments are going to be user ID and password. Okay, now if we create a user, so I'll just give you an example of how we might create the user. I'll do that down here so you can see how that's done. It really wants to indent here. Okay, so if I've said user equals user Bob CS rocks 55. Okay, I just created a user named Bob and create another user. Shy CS rocks 55. Okay, so that's how it works. That's how you're going to use it. Now, let's write the code to make the constructor work. So the first thing I'm going to do is say self.userid. So I'm saying this is a member variable, and I'm going to set that equal to user ID. And I'm going to say self.password is equal to password. Okay, now I have a user with 2 members, user ID and password. Pretty cool. The other thing I'm going to do is a toString method. That's always useful to have. And I'm going to say, if you want to convert this to a string, then let's make it a string that consists of self.userid plus blank plus self.password. All right, cool. And I'm going to get rid of these 2 lines of code because I don't need them. All right, that is pretty much it. Now you might be wondering, hey, what about that found whatever thing about Python that goes on top here? For something like a user class, which is an example of a model, you're never going to run this on its own. It's always going to be used by code somewhere else, so you don't need it. All right, so that's it for our user model. So all users in the system are going to have a user ID and password. We'll save that. Now, the next thing I want to do is I want to write the code for the user DAO. Now, the way you're going to use this typically is, well, you're going to use it in a lot of different ways. So, I'm trying to think of the best way to show you this. I think what I'm going to do is just draw a picture. Yeah, I think that's a good way to do this. So let me bring this back up, and I'll bring the picture up over here as well. I think I've got it here. Let me check my screen sharing options here. There we go. Okay. All right, cool. There we go. Okay, so the data access object, oops, let's change it to that. There we go. Okay, the data access object, DAO, or data access object, is another example of a design pattern. All right, so let's face it, you definitely are going to have many situations where you're writing code and your code needs to manipulate a data store. So what do I mean by that? Well, what I mean is you're going to be storing data in some file, or it could be in something else. It could be in a database. And the data that you're storing is data that you're going to want to manipulate. So what do I mean by manipulate? Well, if you think about it, things that you might want to do with a data store, and I'm using the word data store because it doesn't matter. I mean, for right now, at this exact moment in time, the only data store you know how to use is a file, but there's lots of other data stores that are out there. It could be a remote networked file system somewhere out on the interwebs. It could be a database, and there's tons of different kinds of databases it could be. It could be something that's provided by Google or by Firefox. There's something called Firebase, which is a weird, funky kind of database, a data store that you can use for managing data. But when you have a data store, like a file, let's try that again, like a file, what are the kinds of things that you'd want to be able to do with it, right? If you wrote a program, what are the things that you want to be able to do with a data store? Well, the data store is going to manage data, right? And so let's think about a specific example, the user data store. Well, what are the things you'd want to do with the user data store? The first thing you're probably thinking is read, right? So we might want to read data out of the data store. Okay. What else might you want to do with the data store, though? Like if you were to think about users, other than reading users, that's a very static system if all you can do is read users. So you might want to be able to create users in the data store. All right. What about if a user changes their password? You might want to be able to update users. What about a user that wants to get removed from the system? You might want to delete users. So this common pattern of wanting to manipulate data in a data store has a name. It's actually called CRUD. Kind of gross, but it's called CRUD. So CRUD stands for create, read, update, delete. Now listen to me well. Every time you create a data store, you should always write the methods to create, read, update, and delete data in that data store. Why? Because eventually your application is going to need to do that stuff. In the beginning, you might be thinking, oh, I just need to get the, check the user's password in the database. Well, how does the user get into the database? What if the user wants to change their password? What if the user wants to get out of the database? So you are going to end up in a situation where you create, read, update, and delete. If you think I'm just talking about users, I'm not. Think about emails, right? The emails in your email system, you need to be able to create new emails, read them, you need to be able to delete them, and if your system is super advanced, you might even want to be able to update an email. So CRUD applies with your email system as well, both for users and for emails. and pretty much any kind of system you want to create. Create, read, update, delete. So this is interesting. So if every data store that you have needs to be, you need to be able to create, read, update, and delete, that means that there's probably a common pattern for doing that create, read, update, and delete. And there is, and that's what the DAO is for. The DAO is a common set of things that you think about and you put in your code to create, read, update, and delete data. All right? And so I'm going to tell you what those things are. So first of all, we need to create. Now, I could use the word create. Well, let's think about it specifically for users, all right? So I want to be able to create a user in the data store, but often this is called insert. And the reason why is because that's very database friendly. It doesn't have to be called insert. We could call the method that creates the user the create method. But it's often called the insert method because in a database, that's how you put new. You can still call it inserting a user into the file. So we call it insert. Okay. So you often want to create. You want to read. That's called select. And that's called update. And you want to delete. And that's shockingly called delete. And there's one other method that's really important, and that is a method called populate. And populate method is very common. It's very common to have that populate method inside your data access object or your DAO for a particular model, in this case the user model, just to seed the data store, to get it started with a couple of like test users or sample users. You don't have to have the populate method, but believe me, for the stuff that you're writing, you're going to want it, because if you improperly overwrite the user's file with something that's incorrect and you corrupt it, you have to go back and recreate the user's file. Or if you improperly create the email files, you have to go back and create them again. It's much nicer to have a populate method that's already embedded in your DAO that will automatically reset the database, your data store, whether it's a file or a database, automatically reset it and put in fresh data that you can work with. And in the next version, version 3 of the email application, we're actually going to use a real database. We're going to use a database called SQLite. And that database is, you're not going to be able to edit the files that contain users and emails anymore. They're just going to be stored in this database. And so having a populate method in place is going to be really great in case you corrupt your database somehow or you want to reset it. So trust me, you're going to want the populate method. Now, there's a bunch of helper methods that go along with this, but I'm going to talk about those as we build the program to make this work.